Good evening. My name is Grace Valenzuela, and I am the Communications and Family Community Partnership Director for Portland Public Schools. Welcome to Parent University. Parent U is a forum to bring together parents and caregivers to learn from subject experts and each other. Through classes and events such as this one, and events that are fun, informative, and interactive, we offer topics of importance to families. I'd like to start by saying thank you to Nanette Dyer-Blake and Maureen Clancy for organizing this event and attending to all the details that's necessary for a successful session. I also want to extend my special thanks to our interpreters, Josephine Bisimana, Monique Mutumwinka, Betsy Pasji-Messi, Karina Foley, Shamsa Farah, and Ahmed Jassim. This will help remind our presenters to pause, slow down their speech so our interpreters can catch up with you. They're doing simultaneous interpretation. Tonight's session on reckoning with New England's past and its role in the history of slavery in this country is a two-part presentation discussion on the exploration of slavery in the North and New England's complicity in the global economy of enslavement. We have much to learn from scholars on the subjects, as our history books and regional narratives left out this critical aspect of our past, along with the stories of local Black and Indigenous populations. These omissions impact our understanding of the past and create challenges in connecting our past to our present day and our future as a community and as a nation. We have 5 scholars to present today on the subject. I will introduce one of them, Meadow Dibble, and then Meadow will introduce the rest of her co-presenters. So we know Meadow as a parent in Portland Public Schools. Meadow is the founding director of Atlantic Block Box. Currently a visiting scholar at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, she received her PhD from Brown's Department of French with a focus on post-colonial studies and taught Francophone African literature at Colby College from 2005 to 2008. Originally from Cape Cod, Meadow lived for 6 years on Senegal's Cape Verde Peninsula prior to pursuing her graduate studies. Meadow has been serving as editor of the International Educator newspaper since 2014. And I'll turn it over to Meadow.
Thank you so much, Grace. My colleagues and I are very pleased to be here with you tonight. And we're very grateful for the invitation to engage with Portland's wonderful parent community on the topic of slavery in the North and New England's complicity in the global economy of enslavement. I also want to thank Nanette for all the work she did to organize this event. I'd like to thank Fiona Hopper, who is spearheading critically important community conversations in view of developing Portland Public Schools' Africana Studies curriculum. Special thanks too, from all of us, to Superintendent Botana for his enlightened leadership through a very trying time. And if you'll allow me just one more shout out. I know I speak for many hundreds of families in the district when I thank all of our incredible educators at Portland Public Schools who have worked so hard and with so much heart to keep our children safe and engaged during this difficult year. It is no small feat, and it means everything to us. Thank you. No doubt, like many of you, I feel extremely fortunate every day to be raising my children in Maine's most diverse school district. And I feel all the more fortunate that ours is a district deeply committed to diversity, that it values diversity and works continuously to ensure greater equity for the benefit of all of our children. As a parent, I have learned a ton from parent university sessions myself. This ongoing series of conversations gives us as parents the opportunity to learn in community about topics of vital importance for the healthy development of our children, because no one gave us a manual, of course, let alone a manual on parent teaching our way through a pandemic. But of course, if they had, such a book would be quickly outdated given the rapid pace of change today and the need to constantly, oftentimes dramatically, pivot and adapt in the face of increasing uncertainty. And as we will talk about tonight, in the face of dramatic new revelations. It turns out that manuals are really not all that useful. In fact, following them is downright dangerous when working with human beings and all of their wonderful diversity. Increasingly, we are hearing educators say the same about textbooks as well. Not super useful, these static tomes that claim to authoritatively cover a subject as complex as history. History according to whom? There's a Senegalese proverb that says, the story of the hunt is passed down by the hunter. So who tells the story of the hunted? Whose stories did we grow up hearing? The convergence over this past year of a global pandemic and a worldwide reckoning with racial injustice has shown a glaring light on brutal inequities riddling every sector of our society. These are the legacy of our nation's 400-year-long history of racial violence and oppression. Many, in watching all of this come to light, have insisted they had no idea of the gravity and the magnitude of the racial disparities that plague us in the US today. And it's true that the official history we learned at school did not prepare us for this moment. But we can and we must do better for our children. Because what we don't know actually does hurt us. It's just that it hurts some of us much more than others. What we have come to acknowledge over the past year at last is that white ignorance is literally deadly to Black and Brown and Indigenous members of our communities. If the unvarnished truth about our nation's relationship to slavery has never made its way into a textbook or been taught in any comprehensive way in our schools, we here in New England face an even bigger problem. Atlantic Black Box grew out of the realization that here in New England, we've been telling a very partial and highly biased version of our region's history, one that celebrates our maritime heritage without acknowledging that New England vessels were at the very center of the slave trade, and that this region owes its economic ascent in the 18th and 19th centuries to the brutal exploitation of enslaved Africans. Only these crimes against humanity were largely happening overseas. It's a version of history propagated here in New England that also effaces the presence and contributions of the Black and Indigenous communities that were integral to the identity of this place. Through collaborative research, place-based education programs, digital humanities projects, events, and advocacy, Atlantic Black Box seeks to engage the public in the collective rewriting of our regional history. No manuals, no textbooks, no ultimate authorities. We are crowdsourcing history. What we have launched is a grassroots historical recovery movement powered by citizen historians and guided by a broad coalition of scholars, community leaders, artists, archivists, museum professionals, anti-racism activists, and critically, educators. Together, we are asking, why have we been telling certain stories about New England and not others in our classrooms, in our museums, broadly in the public sphere? How did we come to unknow the region's deep complicity in the institution of slavery and systems of oppression? As we work to recover this repressed knowledge, what concrete actions in the present might its acknowledgement recommend or require of us? How does this seemingly remote history relate to our current national conversations about race, privilege, identity, and access to the American dream? But we are definitely not asking people to do history for history's sake. We are building a black box. You know, these devices on aircraft that record critical flight data. In the event of a tragic crash, it is the black box that allows investigators to reconstruct events leading up to the accident. Built to be nearly indestructible, we might think of the black box as an archive. Recovering the black box is a form of historical recovery, both literally and metaphorically. Knowing what happened helps to bring closure to grieving families, but for many, comfort only comes with knowing that a concerted effort is being made to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. And that is the true purpose of the black box. It is a device that records history in the interest of progressing towards a better future. And that is our model at Atlantic Black Box. Recover the past to help us recover our humanity in the present. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you my colleagues. Kate Mcmahon is a museum specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian, where she leads research efforts at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery. Kate received her BA in art history and her master's in American and New England studies right here in Portland from the University of Southern Maine. She completed her PhD in history at Howard University in 2017. Kate's current research explores New England's connections to and complicity in the illegal slave trade and colonialism. Kate serves as a scholarly advisor to the Black Box Project. Linda Ash Ford is an educator and storyteller with over 40 years of classroom experience. She is a trained facilitator on issues of diversity and inclusion. Using her background in education, Linda shares stories with Afrocentric themes that help to illuminate the lives of people of color. She holds a BA in communication and theater from the University of Hartford, and a master's in education from Antioch, New England Graduate School. Linda lives in Brunswick, Maine. Dustin Ward hails from Presque Isle. He attended the University of Southern Maine, graduating in 2010 with a BS in political science and a minor in economics. After receiving his degree, Dustin felt called to ministry as a pastor, and he went on to complete his Master of Divinity in the spring of 2019 at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. It was the death of George Floyd at the hands of police that ultimately sparked Dustin's decision to step away from ministry and to pursue racial equity and reconciliation work. This led him to found It Is Time LLC and to commit to advocating for his Black and Brown brothers and sisters in an effort to end systemic racism in all forms here in Maine and New England. Seth Goldstein grew up on Cape Cod, like me, where he developed his passion for maritime history. He received his bachelor's degree in European history from the University of California at Santa Cruz and his master's in world history from Northeastern University. Seth taught history at the University of New England and at Southern Maine Community College before landing his current position at the Maine College of Art. Seth also provides guided historic walking tours of Portland's Old Port neighborhood through his tour business, Main Street Tours, and for Atlantic Black Box as well, where he serves as education coordinator. And the last thing I'm going to point out before passing it on to Seth is that, as Grace noted, we have 2 sessions scheduled, the second one taking place next Wednesday, where we very much hope to speak with you again on different but related topics. Seth?
Thanks, Meadow. So we're going to just go over some key terms here. Preferred terms versus terms that are outdated. And so I'm going to address some of these terms, and then Dustin has some terms as well that he's going to address. So the first term that we're going to address is enslaved Africans. I prefer enslaved Africans to slaves because the term enslaved Africans reminds us that this was a status that was forced onto Africans by other people. They were enslaved. This term self-emancipating person, as opposed to runaway slave. I like this term self-emancipating because it suggests the agency that individuals showed when they made the decision to flee from enslavement in the American South. Too often, we think of self-emancipating people as passive, and part of that is a result of the terminology that comes from the Underground Railroad, where they're described as passengers. But really, these were incredibly brave individuals who made a decision to free themselves. And finally, the term Atlantic World Slave Economy, as opposed to the term Triangle Trade or Atlantic World Economy. And this term, Atlantic World Slave Economy, reminds us that is the labor of enslaved Africans that are driving, the engine that are driving the entire Atlantic world economy in the 18th and 19th century. Also, this term African diaspora, as you can see at the bottom there, is a term that I use to describe both African Americans and people from the African homeland who may have migrated at a later time. And this includes people from the islands off the west coast of Africa, including, for example, the Cape Verdean. Now, Linda, you have some strong feelings about the term African American. Could you share those with us?
Yes, I would love to. The term African American is a perfectly acceptable term. However, I add something to that term when I discuss myself, and that comes from the recent understandings I've had of my own family background and its connection to not only enslaved people in the United States, but also tracing my lineage back through the Middle Passage into Africa. I spent some time in Ghana at the castle in where my ancestors may have left from. And at that point, I realized how important it was to delineate that my heritage comes from those people. Therefore, I say I'm an African American who traces her lineage back to the Middle Passage. That's very important in terms of how I define myself. It's also a lesson in the fact that all of us can define ourselves in many different ways, and asking for respect in doing that.
I would say thank you, Linda. It is great to hear that as an understanding. And it's important to understand that terms can be used to identify. Words have weight, and they have power. And many of these terms have been used to lump individuals together. And so it's important for us to understand those differences and those nuances and how those have been creating identities with different communities. Terms you'll see listed on the slide. First, colored. Colored was a term that was sought to be changed initially by Booker T. Washington and later W.E.B. Du Bois. They both thought that the term colored was more inferior, and thus Black and brown individuals should be referred to as Negro with a capital N. And this was around 1900. After the term colored began to be faded out, this term Negro began to be used to identify whole groups of individuals. And when we look at literature that dates probably prior to the 1980s, this is the term that usually is described when we look at those who trace their lineage to what Linda was talking about and what others see in terms of slavery, especially within the United States. It was actually Stokely Carmichael who was one of the first to claim that that term really created inferiority with African Americans that were here in the US. You see, upon slavery originating from Spain and in Portugal, the word that they used for Black was negro or negra in Spanish and in Portuguese. That variation of that word in Latin, negrum, also meant Black, dark, or dusky. And thus it was used to lump all individuals who were Black together. Another term that continues to be used in our history is mulatto. And it's a term that is used to describe those who are a product of intermarriage between white and Black individuals. You see, intermarriage was deemed illegal in parts of America through this with white and Black individuals. Racial mixing was actually seen as disgraceful, as bad, or as wrong. This idea that races just didn't mix. And so mulatto individuals, as they were called, were actually considered Black because of the American one-drop rule. That rule was used to really segregate any individual that had at least one drop of African blood in their bloodline. By establishing that, anyone considered mulatto, African, and or Black were all lumped together. And what this allowed was for them to be considered non-citizens here in the United States at the inception and during the times that we're about to talk about tonight. What it did is it granted an ability to really deny this whole group of any rights of property, liberty, voting, or other basic items within American citizenship. And so it's important for us to understand these are the terms that have been used. But our culture has shifted, and how we describe and differentiate and how we claim that identity, as Linda has just said. Most recently, as we've discussed racism here in America, we use the term BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Now, that term possibly first appeared in 2013, but we're noticing it's finding its popularity in the last year. It has become one of the more inclusive terms to try to talk about all of those who've been marginalized as individuals. This group usually associates with this term because there's a shared common understanding of racism based on the color of one's skin. And what it tries to do is reflect a shared unity that we are all citizens and members within the United States, and are trying to work against these trappings of white supremacy and systemic racism. Now, why do we focus so heavily on these terms on the outset? It's because terms have a historical context. They have been given value. They have weight, especially in reference to other individuals and other terms along the way. People of color are tracing their lineage through what is going to be presented tonight. And what's rooted at them is identifying markers, especially with what has happened, as Linda has said in the middle passage. So we, as part of this diaspora, as part of our ancestry, we have the right to define ourselves, absolutely. And these terms all show us how through time we have been stuck here in America on this issue, and how we continue to evolve and try to figure our way out. And hopefully this will bring some revelation to how we move forward. And so with these terms, Linda, I think the best way to understand further is to tell the story, which is key to how we understand. So I'll turn it over to Linda.
How much do you really know about about slavery in America? We're going to take a quiz. This quiz is from the Southern Poverty Law Center. It is part of their program teaching hard history. Because if you don't know what you don't know, you won't be able to find out what you need to know. I'm going to read the question. There will be several answers. Choose one in your head, and then I will tell you the answer. Are we ready? The first question is, people enslaved by colonists in North America include all but the following: A, Irish, B, Muslims, C, Native Americans, or D, West Africans. Take a minute and choose one. The answer is A, Irish. While the Irish were discriminated against in the United States in the early days of our country, they were never enslaved people. Number 2, why did the South secede from the Union? A, to preserve states' rights. B, to protect taxes on imports. C, to preserve slavery. And D, to avoid rapid industrialization. Take a minute to choose your answer. The answer is C, to preserve slavery. Lots of people believe it's other things. We'll talk about that later. 3, which formally ended slavery in the United States? A, to preserve, A, the treaty ending the Civil War. B, the Civil Rights Act of 1968. C, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Or D, the Emancipation Proclamation. And the answer is C, the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. What is the Middle Passage? Is it A, a system of roads in West Africa? B, another name for the triangle trade? C, the journey across the Atlantic of Africans stolen for the slave trade? Or D, a type of ship especially to transport human beings? And the answer is C, the journey across the Atlantic of Africans stolen from the slave trade. Question 5. How many of our first 18 presidents owned enslaved people at some point in their lives? A, 3, B, none, C, 12, or D, 6? And this time I want to show you the answer. The answer is 12. The first 6 presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, and Tyler, all owned slaves while in office. The second group, Presidents Van Buren, Harrison, Polk, Taylor, Johnson, and Grant, owned enslaved people, but not while they were in office. But what's important to remember is that there were presidents who had owned enslaved people from the beginning of our country's history all the way up through and past the Civil War. Take a minute and think about how much you know as we do the last question. At the peak of the slave trade, how many Africans were taken and transported across the ocean in one single decade of 10 years? Was it A, 860,000, B, 520,000, C, 260,000, or D, 80,000? And the answer is A. In one single 10-year period, over 860,000 Africans were transported across the ocean in that single decade in the slave trade. I say those things because, believe it or not, when I first took this test, I only passed it with 3 correct answers. At which point I realized that I was in a position of doing something that's called the danger of a single story. Now, the danger of a single story is not that history is wrong. That's not it. And recently, I had watched a TED Talk by Mrs. Adache on the danger of the single story. And she articulated much better than I ever could have what we need to do in order to give a more complete picture of slavery. Because it's not that the typical view of our history is all wrong. It's that it's usually told from one view through one common lens. Now, most history is therefore a single story that does not allow for the view of others who are also a part of that story. This single story, simplified and told over and over and over again, leaves out that which makes the other relatable and human. It teaches that one can pity, fix, save the other, but never does it teach that the other is equal to and capable of self-determination. Now, I have experienced my own sense of danger of the single story. When I was in college, my white roommate had a problem with how I was acting. She thought I wasn't Black enough because she felt I didn't love what she considered to be Black music and Black art forms. According to her, my writing didn't reflect what she thought was the true Black experience. She couldn't understand that my Black experience included my father who sang opera to me as a child, or that I grew up surrounded by Black educated adults who watched out for each other in our segregated neighborhoods of the North. That story just did not ring true for her because she had one historical context for who I was. But it's not just her lens that was very narrow. I've learned recently that my own lens is very narrow. As I began to research my family history and trace it well back into the days of slavery, I began to realize that I too was affected by the danger of the single story. Because the narrative of my family does not fit the story of slavery that most of us learned in school. That story was a story of Black victims who were saved by white abolitionists from terrible, nasty, evil Southern white slave owners. Nowhere in that story did it reflect any of the nuances of the truth of more than a single story of history. When I found out that I come from a long line of free people of color who lived in both the North and the South, I realized that something in my history story was missing, and it turned my understanding of slavery on its head. Because I have come to understand that my ancestors, free and enslaved, were not victims who had no say in their destiny. But from my research, I have learned that they are brave people who endured hardship and oppression and had to make very difficult choices. Finding out that many of them learned to read or write when it was dangerous, if not illegal, to teach people of color to read and write, I began to understand that there was a danger in the story that said that people of color were not people who were interested in education, and that somehow being Black and being educated is incompatible. The story of the history of my family means that that story is incorrect. When I learned that some of my ancestors who were free people of color in Virginia in the late 1820s found the need to flee to Ontario, Canada after 1830, I asked myself why. Why did they have to leave? Why did they go to Canada? Why didn't they stop in the North? After all, they weren't enslaved people, they were free people of color. But as I dig deeply into the story of the North and its connection to the slave trade, its race relations, and the economics of that trade, I began to understand their reasons for the choices that they made. The other stories that I have learned have helped me to see that has helped me to see my family's true place in history and how our shared story is the view that all of us need to begin to understand. Because it's not until we understand this history that we can begin to see our place in it and understand what we can do to move ahead together. We cannot begin to plot the course of our future collectively together until we can understand collectively the past that we all share. Then we can begin to plan our future. But it's important to know what that past is.
Thank you, Linda. It's really powerful. And good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Next slide, Meadow. So, yes, thank you. You might want to hit it twice more. The advanced slide, not that. Yes, sorry. I am going to really try to contextualize what Linda was just talking about. How can we know the facts? So there are a lot of resources currently available to us on the internet. One of them is this fantastic resource you see here, slavevoyages.org. The graphic that is running in the top right-hand corner is data that was taken from slavevoyages.org and turned into a visual representation of the slave trade over time. So I'm just gonna let that run while I talk a little bit about these numbers. Global slavery impacted every part of our world. It touched nearly every continent on Earth in some way. The trade was driven by waterways, oceans, rivers, all kinds of other types of pathways. Technology advancements accompanied the slave trade. And these advancements helped drive an increase in the slave trade. So with faster ships and better ships, you see more people being transported. And you'll see that in particular as this enters the 1750s to 1800. This had an immense human toll. The average mortality rate aboard slave ships during the whole period of the slave trade was around 15%. Yet at times on some vessels, it was 30% or higher. This is especially true for the period of the illegal slave trade after 1808, which you'll notice here at 1808 what happens to the trade. After 1808, New England played an even larger role in the slave trade than it had during the previously legal period. New England ships and captains and sailors transported untold thousands of enslaved people to Cuba and Brazil between 1808 and at least 1863. Next slide. So Maine was involved in the legal slave trade, so the slave trade prior to 1808. But we don't know a whole lot about Maine's role in the slave trade. We have a few issues with assessing New England's true role. There's really a lack of research. Really, there are few scholarly works that describe Maine's role in particular, as well as the rest of northern New England in the slave trade. There's also a misunderstanding of what the slave trade was. Most people, when they think of a slave ship, they think of a ship that was only built to transport enslaved people. But that simply wasn't the true nature of the slave trade. Most slave ships were regular merchant vessels. Sometimes they acted as slave ships, sometimes they traded other commodities like rum or sugar or cotton. We in New England love to champion our maritime history, and we love to think about how wonderful our ship captains' houses are and how beautiful they are. And we never really think about where all these men made their money in the 19th century. And we need to begin to understand that many of these vessels, while they were transporting their other merchant goods, were also transporting enslaved people. And I'll get to that a little bit more later. Because of these different things that are limiting our understanding, we have not, a lot of these stories are likely hidden in the archives across New England. So Atlantic Black Box is really working to try to uncover this history by asking us all to reassess what we know and question the history that we've always been taught of the free North, like what Linda was talking about. Was it really the free North? I would argue that it was not. Next slide. So after 1808, when the United States abolished its legality of the participation of Americans in the slave trade, Maine vessels continued to participate in this activity. There were very few landings in the United States itself after 1808. We know of a handful, but the participation of New England vessels and sailors and captains in the foreign slave trade after 1808 was massive, and it continued to grow in the years after 1808, to such an extent that there was a subsequent series of laws passed in 1818, 1819, and 1820 that increased the penalties on people who were caught participating in the slave trade. And that was because it had proceeded with complete lawlessness between 1808 and 1820. So in 1820, at the same time that Maine statehood was being debated in Congress, and they were debating on whether to expand slavery into the Western states, there was also a debate on how to penalize Americans participating in the foreign slave trade. And it was finally made piracy, which was punishable by death. So this was a very serious penalty. And yet, despite the fact that there were thousands of people engaged in this activity, only one person was ever actually executed for this crime. And his name was Nathaniel Gordon, and he was from Portland, Maine. In 1862, he lost his final appeals in the case of the slave ship Erie, which was built in Elliott and transported hundreds of enslaved people to Cuba. Gordon was hung in New York because of the pressure of Lincoln and the context of the Civil War. But prior to that, the government was not interested in prosecuting Americans participating in this slave trade. Next slide. So what did that mean? It meant that millions and millions of dollars was flowing back to New England. It meant that millions of dollars was going to found our cultural institutions, our banks, our whole political structure in many of our towns. With my research, I have been looking for these vessels that were engaged in the illegal slave trade. And I have found at least 75 Maine ships that were engaged in slave trading in the 1850s to Cuba. And you can see here, they transported at least 18,000 people to Cuba just during a very short time period of about a decade. And you can also see that I only know the figures for about half of these voyages in terms of the number of people that were brought to Cuba. What I find is generally very little information other than the voyage was successful. So we will never truly know, often with many of these cases, the true scope of New England's involvement. And it's also important to note that everyone here who I have recorded are the people that got caught. So there's still an untold huge number of people who never got caught, the risks were very high. And so why would people engage in this activity when they could lose everything, including up to their lives? The profits were worth it. And so you can see here, I have broken down, the number in white is the number that is what the sale price was in 1855, for example. And the number in red is it converted into today's dollars. So the average price of a person in Cuba was about $12,000 in today's money in 1855. So that netted an average sale per journey for many of these slave ships of $8.3 million. The net profits for the owners at the end of these journeys were $3.1 million. And the estimated value of this fleet is $332 million in today's money. That's a lot of money. Even for an industry today in Maine, for something to be pulling in $350 million is a lot of money. And of course, since we only know a small component of these figures, the number is likely much, much higher. Next slide. And so we can also interpret some other things about New England's and Maine's involvement in the slave trade. And that includes Maine's involvement in the domestic slave trade, the slave trade along the coastal United States between the upper South and the lower South. And you see here 2 ship manifests for 2 different vessels owned by the Soule family in Freeport. And you can see here that these were entire families being sold south to New Orleans, to Mobile, to Natchez, Mississippi. On the left, aboard the brig Susan Soule, named after Rufus's wife, we see Caroline and her 2 small children, aged 6 and 1, were sold. And transported aboard this Susan Soule along with cotton and sugar and rum as the vessel was moving up and down the coast. Next slide. So really, this is a building block of the New England economy. To put this into perspective, I looked for what the value of the timber industry was at the same time period. The timber industry was estimated to be valued at $2.5 million in 1852. And that's in 1852 money, which means that Maine's slave ship fleet, valued at $11 million, was almost 4 times as valuable as its timber industry. And some of this timber was going into the ships. And some of that timber was being traded for enslaved people and traded in Cuba and other places. And you can see here this newspaper article from 1857 from the Portland Advertiser, which says that 3 of the slave vessels recently captured and taken into Havana are said to have been built with Boston and Portland capital. And when captured, Eastern people were on board as officers and as part of crews. Another of the vessels had been owned by parties in Massachusetts, sorry about my dogs, Maine and New York, and was sold with the knowledge that she was intended for the slave trade. One had 460 Africans on board and another 116. Let not the slave oligarchy despair. So long as northern men can be found to carry on the African slave trade, there will be no difficulty in keeping up a pro-slavery political party at the North under the stimulus of the spoils of office. Next slide. So one of these merchants and slave traders was Rufus Soule, who was from Freeport. Rufus was a, just gonna mute myself. Sorry, Rufus was one of the most notable shipbuilders in Freeport during the 19th century, and is said to have built 100 ships by his 65th birthday. And we've got a very uncomplicated memory of Rufus in Freeport so far. Just thought he was perhaps a very good merchant. But when you begin to peel back the layers a little bit, you see that Rufus was a staunch Jacksonian Democrat. He was also who supported the expansion into the westward territories and the removal of indigenous people through the West as it was expanded. And he goes on to become a member of the American Colonization Society, building ships and helping to fund ships being built, to bring free African Americans back to Liberia, whether they wanted to go or not. He also owned several slave ships, one of them being the Rufus Soul, a vessel of the same name, of his name. On July 6, 1858, the Rufus Soul, which was registered out of New Orleans, was consigned to a notorious slave dealer in Matanzas, Cuba, whose name was Cristobal Valdez, for about $5,000, which was a huge consignment fee, about twice as much as what one would normally get. The C.J. Helm, the United States Consul General in Cuba, noted that the brig had all of the usual activities taken to hide what they were trying to do. They destroyed the logbook. They hid there was no manifest. There was nothing to show what they were really doing. After it was briefly held in Africa and then in Cuba, it was discovered that they had successfully landed a cargo of hundreds of enslaved people, number unknown, and the vessel was subsequently burned. He also owned and built the bark Chieftain, which the newspaper article on the right is talking about, which was consigned on behalf of the American Colonization Society in 1851, and returns empty from Liberia by way of Havana with 3,000 Spanish silver and 2,300 Spanish doubloons, a huge amount of money and no cargo. So it's very likely that that vessel was a slave ship as well, because its captain was Frederick Drinkwater of Portland, who's perhaps the most notorious slave ship captain that I've found. Next slide. Drinkwater, you can see here, captained a number of slave ships during, at least a dozen slave ships during the 1850s. He was born on August 3rd, 1817 in Portland, and he was the son of David Drinkwater Jr. of Yarmouth. The Drinkwaters were wealthy and connected merchant and maritime ship captains. Frederick married Jane B. Milliken, who was the daughter of David's business colleague at the Bank of Cumberland. See, all of these men are very connected, in 1842, and they settled into a home on Cumberland Avenue in Portland on Mungi Hill. By 1850, he becomes deeply embroiled in the slave trade. The first vessel that he captained under suspicious circumstances was the Chieftain, which was built by Rufus Soul in 1849. It transported, the vessel first transported people on behalf of the American Colonization Society, at least 500 people. And then the vessel was implicated in the slave trade in 1852. And Drinkwater went on to see that this was a very lucrative business. So he essentially becomes one of the main captains that Cuban slave traders are working with during this time period to find American vessels. So he owned the following slave ships: the Abbot Devereux, the Brahmin, the Chieftain, the Cosmopolitan, the Florina, the Gambia, the Joseph H. Record, the Minnetonka, the Niagara, the R.B. Lawton, the Susan Soul, and the White Cloud. He transported alone likely thousands of enslaved people aboard his ships, and yet we've never heard of him. He never got in trouble. It was well known that he was doing this. It was in the British parliamentary papers. It was in the United States congressional papers. It was in the newspapers. He never suffered any consequences, and neither did really anybody. And so all of these men who made all of these millions of dollars came back to New England and helped found all of our cultural institutions, our banks. They were members of our town governments and city governments. And I think it's important that we understand and we begin to really unpack our deep, deep entanglement with the economies of enslavement and how New England, despite the fact that slavery here was a smaller institution than it was in the South, how we were deeply reliant upon slavery and the economies of enslavement. So I'm gonna push it over to Dustin to kind of wrap it all up and bring it all on why this all matters.
Thank you, Kate. Really appreciate that. And I believe that that may be a question we have. Well, why does all of this information and history matter to us? And first off, it helps orient us to today's problems. We may be asking the question, why Black Africans? And first off, there were attempts to use indigenous people of the West, Native Americans at the time, those who were in this country first. But one reality was they were easily able to escape because they knew this land. There was also too few of them at the time. Many were not prepared for the heavy slave labor that was going to be placed upon them. But most of the time, most were actually destroyed if they resisted slavery. And so one of the other key issues is enslaving such individuals who Europeans traded goods and furs with could actually hurt the European economy. So those attempts were thrown by the wayside. There were attempts to even use poor whites, but this caused too many political problems. They believed it could stop the flow of white individuals to the new colonies, and it could really mess up or confuse this idea of whiteness, the social, religious, and psychological issue of what it meant to be white and come to these colonies. And again, there was too few. So the reality is, what we have laid out tonight, Africans were chosen and plucked for slavery by white individuals. There were no political issues, no loss of economic supply. They were experienced in their agricultural farming. There was even context that says there was many of them. There is even context that says there was a whole dark continent as it was written. These individuals were alien, they were non-Christian, they were non-white, they had no identity to white Europeans. So what ends up happening is they are considered the other. And by being other, they could be treated as less than. And that's the problems we see today. We see people as other. And that's not based on miseducation, that's missed education. And it helps us explain why BIPOC members are hurting, we're pained, and many times we're lost. Because those who find their heritage and their ancestry and their lineage in this story, the story of the Middle Passage, can see the foundations of oppression and hatred. And we can see racism begin and stem from this European and white history that parts of, as Kate has described, were not taught to us. This is what's birthed enslavement and the slave trade. So when we understand this history, we can begin to empathize with the hurt that Black and brown individuals are facing. And it becomes a reminder of the tragedy, that symbols and stories can be gut-wrenching. They can unearth pain. And it's a reminder of what the truth of America is, because we have trying to process an identity within this, the tension of loving this nation while also hating what it has done. And to know that scores of wealth, as Kate has laid out, have been created off the backs of Black and brown individuals. That both individuals, companies, churches, monarchies, all made their money on slaves. Enslavement built communities, such as Hispaniola, Barbados, the Carolinas, Virginia, and as we've heard tonight, even pieces of Maine. It is said that Europe's Industrial Revolution was built on the back of bloody foundations of African forebears. Vincent Harding actually said this in one of his books, There Is a River. Next slide. And this is why we come to this conversation, because it's so dangerous to live in myths and untruths. Those can be so harmful. And the first reason why is because in lies and myths and untruths, that doesn't provide good context, because we can take events out of context and redefine their meaning. We can make history mean what we want it to mean. And what it does is it twists our understanding of one another. We can begin to misunderstand symbols, words, and phrases, and they can be used as weapons against one another. But also it can create this veil, this veneer, We can begin to pretend that these events didn't even happen. We can begin to build our identities of ourselves even off these lies. And man, when those lies are exposed, our system can begin to erode, our society can begin to erode, because what happens is trust is lost. We lose trust in people. We lose trust in information. That's why it's so hard, even now sometimes. What do you believe? What is fact? What is fiction? Because we've lost trust and faith in the history that has been so much thrown away. And it also further separates us. I can begin to disassociate myself from you and believe in these falsities. I can almost begin to be seen better than you. You become inferior because of the history that I'm not willing to accept. Thus, I can't empathize. I can't personalize with one another in this way. And third slide, next slide. History is important for us today. What's been said here today is so important. First off, the two pictures that you see represent statistics of the non-white population here in Maine, both by county and by city. And the reason we show this is because this conversation is important, because those pictures depict that almost every area in Maine, there is someone who is Black or brown that is represented. At least one person is affected by this history throughout the state. This is not just a Portland issue, although we appreciate Portland and Portland Public Schools offering this opportunity to us. This is not just a Lewiston issue. This is not just an urban issue. Black and brown people live all over Maine, and we all deserve to have that history appreciated equally. Next slide. But on top of this, we need to begin to understand our own surroundings. This history reminds us we are on hallowed ground, how the cities and the towns and the places of worship that we are in and that we pass by, how they came to be, and how it forces us to appreciate and to honor them, to recognize where we live, that it's interwoven with this history. So when you walk by these places, you drive through these towns, you will always recall the truth and the history that you've learned. But more so, this history helps us begin to humanize one another. Slavery and enslavement has been so dehumanizing to the people that it affected, and history teaches us how this happened. BIPOC members have so far too often been dehumanized based on the color of their skin, based on race. All from actions that have really sprouted from this, whether it's social stigma, legal, or even the physical pains. There are scars that have been left from these actions. But history can show us how we can humanize one another once again. How the stories of which you've heard today help bridge us towards that humanity. And thus we can reconcile our present and move forward. Because this history reminds us how far we have come, how far we've got to go. We can begin to deal with some of these ills that so much has been taught to us, but it's been whitewashed and we've missed so much. We can begin to fully grapple with this history and reconcile our own true identity. And this can, yes, help us move forward. And that's what we're hoping to do with this type of information, with this history. To know where you come from helps you make better choices for the future. We can begin to avoid dehumanizing language and action. And we can reorder our steps towards affirmation and support of one another. We'll deconstruct these terms and reconstruct inclusivity. And we can begin to cease labeling individuals who stand up for this history and stand up for the rights of our BIPOC brothers and sisters. That's why this fight continues and this history continues to be unearthed. It's to help us shape a stronger future and to stop seeing the other and begin to empower and grow closer together. And so with that, we appreciate you taking the time to listen. Hopefully you've been fully educated on all these matters. Some you may have known, some things you're learning for the first time. And so we want to take an opportunity and answer some questions if you have them. You can use the Q&A bar at the bottom. It's a great place to put your questions. Already seen one that we will definitely answer. But this will be a great time where you can ask a question of any of the panelists, and then we'll definitely try to answer as much as we can in the time that we have.
So I will admit that I was not looking at the chat while others were speaking because I didn't, I needed to advance slides. And so if others who were monitoring the chat see questions, please jump in and take them.
I see a question here from Michael Young to me, and he asks, how do you conduct your research? And that's a very complicated question, but because there's no real one way. I have been doing this research for probably about 8 or 9 years now, so it's been a very slow process. I primarily use historic newspapers. I use the British parliamentary papers as well as congressional records. I also use individual archives. I have spent many, many hours sifting through dusty papers to begin to really understand the scope of this. But I have thousands and thousands of pages of shipping news saved on my computer, as Meadow can attest to. So it really is slow, painstaking research, and does require a certain level of creativity because, as I said, and when I was talking, it's illegal. So people tried to hide what they were doing. And so you have to be really good at reading between the lines and knowing how to look for things and what kinds of things to look for.
I'd like to add to that. There's also a way for people who are not steeped in how to do historical research to do your own research. You can do it with your students. You can do that by using the census. You can do that by asking some key questions from the information that you find. I know for myself, once I started tracing my ancestors through death records, through obituaries, through the census, then you start to ask questions. It's really great when you're doing it with students because it brings up lots of questions. Like, for instance, why can't I find this person in the census? I know they were a relative, but suddenly they disappeared. If they were enslaved people, they were not in the census because, and then that poses another question. Why weren't they in the regular census? Well, they're on the slave registries. Why aren't their names on the slave registries? Well, that happened because of a big argument in 1830 between the North and the South in the Senate. And then you can put some real context into all those dates that history teachers usually teach. You learn, as teachers, you make kids learn about the compromise, the 3/5 compromise and all those sorts of things, but they never connect them to the people that those compromises, those arguments, and those acts were about. And when I did my own family research, I had questions, and suddenly I realized that what happened when they passed the slave codes in Virginia in 1820 affected why my relatives who were free people of color had to leave the United States. You'll be surprised what you can find, even as a layperson, when you start to look. And that's the value of this project. It's not just for professional historians. It can be for your students. It can be for your kids. It can be for yourself.
I'll give an example. To the question about educational resources, we're absolutely in the process of developing resources for educators. But I want to mention that our model is really very much to involve young people in the process of unearthing this history. I'll give you the example of the 1820 Ship News Project. So this being the 200th anniversary of Maine's accession to statehood, we thought it would be an interesting moment to ask students to participate in answering the question that we've heard quite a bit: what should we be celebrating in this year of commemoration? And so we collected the Ship News column from the Eastern Argus newspaper, which is the predecessor to the Portland Press Herald, for every time that it appeared over the course of the year 1820. And then we asked students, and we piloted this with with Professor Eve Raymond's class at USM. We asked students to parse the data from the shipping news and to enter into a database the names of the vessels, names of the captains, if available, what the vessel was carrying, but most importantly, where the vessel was coming from and where it was headed to. So that rather than tell the students how deeply involved Maine was in the economy of the West Indies in 1820, the students had the experience of actually providing hard data to establish the fact that, wow, fully half of these voyages were in contact with the plantations of the West Indies. I'll stop there. Does somebody else see a question they want to jump?
Meadow, I saw a question that I wanted to address. People were requesting resources for teaching some of these topics, and I just wanted to recommend, there's this wonderful book that I use a lot. This is American Slavery, Understanding and Teaching American Slavery, and this is the companion book to the Teaching Hard History podcast. It is now in its third season, and this is produced by the Southern Poverty Legal Center. It's a wonderful resource that details how to set up a safe environment in the classroom to discuss these topics, and then how to address the topic of American slavery with various age groups, from kindergarten on up and through college students, like the college students that I teach at the Maine College of Art. So I have found these resources to be incredible, and I would strongly recommend the podcast, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, as I said, now in its third season, with just an incredible wealth of information for educators.
I would also add that at the same website, you will find Learning for Justice, Teaching Hard History. That's another wonderful resource. And they have, we'll talk about this next week in a little bit more in depth when we have more time. But there is a Teaching Hard History for grades K through 5. And then there's another one that's Teaching Hard History grades 6 through 12. So they break down that into really great rubric that a teacher can follow. And we'll talk a little bit more about teaching the hard history next week. We'll get more in depth in that, but there are resources. There are wonderful resources.
We can also post the resources in our Parent University website, and the recording of this session will also be there for people to access. And the other thing that because people are asking for resources, we can put them on a chat now, but we can also collect all of the resources and post them for everybody to access. The other thing that we are going to put on the chat is a link to an evaluation of the session. This is how we know what people are interested in and how successful we are in doing this presentations. So please complete the survey. It's an important tool for us to gauge what people need. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to say, I know that we're getting short on time. This is a two-part presentation, so we'll be doing another presentation next Wednesday evening, in which I'll be detailing Portland's role in the Atlantic world slave economy and its strong economic connection to plantation slavery in Cuba. And also we'll be discussing the city of Portland's place in the Underground Railroad, which is a great story of really resilience and agency of the Black community here in Portland. Too often we think of, as I said earlier, enslaved people or self-emancipating enslaved people as being passive, but what we'll see next week is that they had a great deal of agency, both the free Black community here in Portland, who helped self-emancipating enslaved Africans, and the enslaved Africans themselves. And we'll also discuss the abolition movement here in Portland and in Maine. And we'll see once again that this was a movement that was really driven by people of African heritage here in Portland. And too often we have a misconception that these were white-driven movements. And it's true that there were white allies who helped people of African heritage with these movements, but I'll look forward to sharing that material with you next week.
And I'd just
The
like to
survey-
thank
oh,
everyone.
The survey link is posted. Just want to make sure that it's in the chat. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your questions. We were not able to answer all of them. We will collect them and we will respond. We hope that you'll come back and join us next week. You can also be in touch with us through our website, www.atlanticblackbox.com. Hope to see you again real soon. And thank you again, Grace and Annette, for the wonderful opportunity.